Hello, everyone. This is Cabane the Christian. Tonight we're going to have our first interview with my brother, Jake, who's going to be talking about why he returned to Christianity, what his personal story is, and some thoughts he has on apologetics, theology, and related matters based on his journey. So, Jake, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Jake. I'm Jacob, and yeah.
So, Jake, could you tell us a bit about your personal faith background? How were you brought up? And before you got into asking questions at a higher level about this stuff, where were you basically at?
Well, I was raised in an evangelical household. My mother is an evangelical. Our mother is an evangelical. Our father's a deist. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a young child, I never really kind of questioned what I believed too much. I think just on a kind of on a personal level, I can't say like growing up I ever felt like particularly kind of connected to the figure of Christ. I almost felt kind of confused by the figure of Christ. I felt the idea of God made much more sense than, you know, Christ as God. So that's kind of some of my background. When I was, around 13, I got into apologetics and started to get into philosophy, and I felt like part of me became somewhat disillusioned with certain aspects of apologetics as I got more into it.
So
Yeah.
What was it that led you to, well, first of all, would you say, let's say before you got into apologetics, to what extent did Christianity and evangelicalism form an important or a conscious part of your identity, if at all?
Yeah, I don't know if it, I mean, I would have identified as a Christian and I would have prayed on occasion, but I can't say it was something like I thought about a lot. I can't say I felt, like I said, I didn't feel a strong connection to the figure of Jesus.
And what was it that led you to, I guess, take a more active interest in what you mentioned, apologetics?
Well, I think it was I think it was the discovery of I think it was the discovery of apologetics itself that kind of led me.
And how did you come to discover that?
Well, I remember you showed me a debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens.
Oh, so that was the...
That was it.
Yeah.
And I think that also led me to my kind of interest in philosophy. And I felt very intrigued that one could, one didn't just have to take these as a matter of faith, but one could argue for them in a rational manner.
And had you ever considered, before that debate, the question of whether you had any reason to believe in Christianity? Because for me, I remember there was a very distinct moment when I realized that Christianity wasn't something that a lot of the world took for granted, and I couldn't really explain why I was taking it for granted. Okay. Would you say you had a similar realization, or would you say you got into apologetics in the discovery of the case for Christianity?
I would say the latter, really. I mean, I think if someone would have pressed me before I discovered apologetics, I would have said something like, nature seems to be designed. But that would be pretty much the extent of it.
And so when you encountered this debate with Craig and Hitchens, what was your take on it?
I mean, I thought it was, I was in some ways, very intrigued. I mean, I thought what was really interesting was that, what really intrigued me about the debate was that William Lane Craig was using, for example, he's the Big Bang as evidence for God. So this was, in some sense, not just that what I saw was not just that science and religion were compatible, but that one could actually use science in defense of Christianity. I think that's what really intrigued me and really stood out.
And so for me, my introduction to apologetics was really a focus on the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and there was really a secondary or tertiary interest in the general defense of theism. Would you say it was kind of the other way around for you?
I would say, the general defense of theism took a more primary role. But I was still, interested in, like I read The Case for Christ, and I think the same summer I discovered that debate. I read The Case for Christ.
And you were 13
I was
at that
13.
point? Yeah, so I was same age as I really discovered apologetics, or really discovered these higher order questions about the truth of Christianity. When would you say you first had conscious doubts about Christianity? Was it before this, or was it in the midst of this?
It was before this, and I would say what really happened was there were there were doubts that kind of accumulated.
So even before you encountered this debate?
Sorry. Post this debate is when kind of doubts really, because in some ways through apologetics I was introduced to the kind of the opposite of what I believed, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say kind of my doubts began to accumulate until I think I found myself one day and I felt like I just didn't believe, right? Is kind of how it was, or I didn't believe and I really wasn't sure what I believed.
Right.
I think there was also, there was also some interest in you could say other religious traditions, and I think one thing was that Christianity as a system or as a worldview wasn't really holding together, as a to make sense of the world, right? It didn't at the time I felt like it didn't make sense of the world.
Right.
And I think even some of my impression was that that the Christian worldview was kind of bland in comparison to other worldviews.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know that you kind of found yourself not believing in 2013.
Yeah.
How old were you at that point?
I was 15.
15. So in the interim, what was your relationship to the various Christian traditions?
What do you mean?
There's evangelicalism, Orthodoxy, Catholicism. To what degree did that constitute a matter of interest or discomfort? What was your active engagement with the Christian community like, and how did that relate to your interest in the truth claims of Christianity in general?
Well, I think, before my conversion, I, was interested.
Before your conversion?
Yeah.
What do you mean by conversion?
Or my deconversion.
Okay.
Yeah. I was attending Orthodox services and things like that, and I think it almost felt like at that. I mean, there are some people who go through that trajectory where like Orthodoxy is almost like the pathway to atheism. Right.
It's kind of their last attempt to make Christianity work.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe how I felt like at the time.
Even as you were thinking of becoming Orthodox.
Yeah. Well, it was like. I mean, this was a while ago, so it's hard to get into my mindset. I think my like evangelical kind of Christianity didn't really make a lot of sense, right?
Right.
So it kind of felt like these more traditional forms of Christianity, seemed to be a little bit more coherent. But at the time, I mean, I think at the time I still had a lot of kind of a very evangelical mindset.
In what sense would you say?
I think it just wasn't, I think kind of how I was brought up and kind of the story that I got was that, so the Christian story that I got was that, man is a sinner, right? And that didn't have a lot of meaning, and
it's kind of an abstraction.
Well, kind of like man is like very naughty or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And for some reason, because of this, man is going to hell. Right.
Yeah, like that video we watched. I'm sorry, I have to send you to hell.
Yeah. And okay, and then God decides to come down as a man. He says some nice things. He dies and rises, and somehow. If we acknowledge him and do certain things and avoid other things, then we'll spend eternity with him, right? So that was kind of the narrative I had, right?
Right.
It was almost very kind of transactional, was kind of the my understanding kind of Christian theology.
Yeah.
So I felt like, when I deconverted, that was kind of what I had in my head as Christianity.
Right.
It was almost this kind of transactional thing to avoid a kind of fiery pit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to ask you a question about the point of your deconversion,
Yeah.
and then circle back around to some of the specific doubts that had been accumulating up to that point. So, to what extent would you say that your deconversion was an emotionally traumatic experience? Would you say it was emotionally traumatic? Would you say you had a crisis of faith, which was very stressful, or was it not really as big of a deal?
Yeah. I mean, it was traumatic in a way, right? I mean, I think some people, when they deconvert or have a deconversion, they're very they feel very attached to Jesus still, right?
Right.
Yeah, I can't say I really felt that, right?
Right.
I mean, like I said before, I felt like Christ almost didn't make sense, kind of growing up.
Yeah.
So it wasn't traumatic in that way. I think it was maybe stressful in the sense of not being sure of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you worried that you were going to go to hell? Was there any of that?
No, there was, yeah. But, I can't say that. I mean, I was worried about that before I deconverted. So
you were kind of spiritually stressed about your own salvation
yeah,
prior to that?
Yeah.
And that was something, how long had you been stressed about your...
I don't know, several years.
Okay, right, yeah. It's a pretty... Yeah. It's not an uncommon experience. So,
yeah.
Let's talk about some of the specific questions that you had leading up to this. Are you able to identify what the first major question in your mind was, or the first kind of argument that led you to question was?
It's hard.
What's the first that you remember, at least?
Okay. Well, I remember, I think my favorite argument for the existence of God was the Kalam cosmological argument.
Right.
And I think I began to have kind of doubts just about that argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
That perhaps the argument didn't rest on as solid grounds as I thought it did.
Mm-hmm.
So
what kind of doubts on that?
Well, if you just look at cosmology, for example, I mean, it's a changing field,
right?
And so it seemed like this idea of the Big Bang being the beginning of the universe was an open question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there was also questions about the nature of time, right? So I don't necessarily share this opinion anymore, but at the time it seemed if the B theory of time was true, which is the kind of the predominant view in physics,
which is that time is an illusion, essentially, or that there's no real present.
Yeah, that the past, present, and future all equally exist, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it seemed like if that was true, well, then the Kalam cosmological argument was faulty, right? Because one could potentially maintain that the universe is eternal.
Yeah, right.
That was my thought at the time.
Right. Was there anyone in particular whom you had encountered who had brought these doubts into your mind?
I mean, I'd watched some criticisms of William Lane Craig. I mean, it seemed like a lot of the arguments, fine-tuning and even things like some of the arguments about, let's say, the resurrection of Christ, for example, they seemed to be thrown into doubt. So I felt like since these were thrown into doubt, I almost kind of wondered what was the foundation of faith. And I guess another thing too is that at the time it was almost like the worldview started to collapse. Kind of the worldview I had didn't make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
It seemed it didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and so as I explained earlier, it was it was almost this kind of transaction, and that people don't acknowledge Jesus, they're going to get thrown into a fiery pit for all eternity.
Yeah.
And at the time, I think I felt like Christianity was a little boring.
Right. Compared to
I mean, you could say, I don't know, like Buddhism or Hinduism or something like that.
Okay.
They almost felt more practical than did Christianity.
Right. Did they have a broader explanatory
Well, I think just in terms of practice, they felt more practical.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you say about your spiritual life at this point? What was that like? Immediate, or in that, let's just say, prior to like crisis point,
Okay.
like prior to the moment where it looked like, oh my gosh, I might actually be deconverting. Did you have a spiritual life to speak of? I know you were going to church.
Yeah.
Was there anything beyond that?
I mean, I did prayers. I tried to pray most days, but I can't say that I really enjoyed praying most days,
Well,
or
yeah.
and it didn't really feel like anything more than just a kind of a transaction.
Had you ever had anything which you could say was the presence of God or a religious experience prior to this point?
I think I could, right? I think I could say there were times in my life, in my childhood, I felt connected to God.
And
But
how old were you, or if you're willing to talk about?
when I felt those feelings,
Yeah.
I mean, I can't pinpoint an age, but there were just moments I felt
Like in your
connected.
young childhood?
Yeah, in my young
Okay.
childhood,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. See, for me, I think maybe one of the differences in our stories is, in addition to kind of the standard evangelical upbringing, I had this huge role that the Jesus film played for me in giving me a very concrete image of the person of Jesus, which, no matter how shallow the theology was, that was something to hold on to and to be attached to, such that it was a reason to keep holding out for answers.
Yeah.
Which, if there aren't answers out there, people sometimes say, oh, well, you're just trying to prove something you want to be true, and that may or may not be the case. But that can be a good thing or a bad thing, because if you want something to be true that doesn't end up being true, you're going to keep searching and you're going to keep making arguments that, by the nature of the case, are invalid. But if what you want to be true happens to be true, or have some close relationship with the truth, it'll motivate you all the more to find those authentic arguments. So the proof is in the pudding, as always. It doesn't matter why you want something, or why you're making an argument, or why you're reading X or Y book, but the question is, what kind of argument is actually being produced? So I think maybe that's a difference between our stories. And and this isn't a comment on you, but I see people, and I don't think you ever did this, but I see people who will describe in hindsight this intense trauma that they went through in deconverting, when I know in reality that they had a 2-week, that their doubts started 2 weeks before they deconverted. And I have to say, I just don't believe that they were as desperate for it to be true as they say in hindsight.
Yeah. And I can't say like my deconversion. I certainly was not desperate for it to be true.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you deconverted,
Yeah.
how would you have described yourself religiously, theologically, philosophically? Where were you at on questions like the existence of God, on materialism? Would you have said, I disbelieve in the historical ideas of Christianity, or I'm not sure, or somewhere in between? Let's start with just most generally. How would you have described yourself?
At the time, I was considering the possibility that maybe materialism was the case, right?
Okay.
That was a serious possibility in my mind.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
even when I was, would have considered myself a Christian,
Yeah.
I thought that materialism still made a sort of intuitive amount of sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and that's true for me too, until 7, 8, 9 years ago.
yeah, so that was I said materialism. I thought was a possibility. I would have said that I wouldn't have ruled out, but I didn't rule out the possibility of God existing. Right.
Right.
I didn't rule out I would have said I was spiritually interested, right? And kind of there, I was kind of interested, you could say, in kind of Eastern religions, kind of broadly speaking. There was some interest in, like, I guess you could say, the New Age movement.
At that point, there was.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
And through what sources?
Just the internet, or they were in some ways very novel kind of ideas.
And what specifically, metaphysically speaking, if
Well,
you remember?
I think the New Age movement isn't a well-defined movement.
Right.
It's essentially a plethora of kind of kind of miscellaneous kind of religious and spiritual ideas, right?
Right, yeah.
And it seemed to me what was appealing about the New Age is that it offered kind of an enchanting view of the world.
Yeah.
It seemed the impression that I got from a lot of Christians that they almost viewed a sort of enchanting kind of vision of the world as almost satanic.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's paganism.
Yeah, that's so it seemed to me that the New Age offered this, where Christianity offered a very bland kind of vision of the world, where it's this transaction, and
So on the question of materialism, why would you have held that to be intuitively, if not likely, but strongly in the realm of possibility? What was the logic there?
I think I bought into a lot of the rhetoric of the new atheists. I think they always say, well, the burden of proof is on the theist.
Yeah, yeah.
Because atheism is simply a lack of belief.
Right, yeah.
So that's if we conceptualize the problem that way, that atheism is a lack of belief in God, right?
Yeah.
Then it does seem to have a sort of intuitive, it makes intuitive sense, right? You're just disbelieving something where there's no evidence.
Yeah, because we already agreed the universe exists, the argument
yeah.
goes. So if we don't have evidence for God, well, there's no reason that it's a 50% probability. I mean, we don't have evidence for the teapot circling the earth.
Yeah.
The argument goes.
But there were still some, even early on, I would say there were some doubts even about that kind of point, right? Because it seemed to me that...
About the atheist kind of point?
Yeah, because they take matter for granted.
Right.
But they don't offer a definition of matter. Like, what is matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And so...
And you were thinking in those terms at this point?
I was thinking, that it doesn't seem to be clear what matter is, and that, well, I guess my thought at the time was that maybe the categories of natural, supernatural were not as accurate.
Yeah, yeah. How about the question of contingency? Was that on your mind?
I was still kind of interested in the debate about God's existence.
Yeah.
So I think there were various forms of, I would say, arguments that I still kind of found kind of interesting. But I would still say...
Like what?
I think, I can't remember my exact thought, but I remember being interested in, the ontological argument.
Right, yeah.
Or some form of the... I think it was, I think I read something about the ontological argument, like Descartes' form of the ontological argument.
Okay, yeah.
That I remember I found kind of interesting at the time. I was still, skeptical of the argument, but I thought it could be true.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you able to because I have not heard of his form of the argument. What makes this different?
I think it was. I could be wrong.
Okay.
But it was something about where we get the idea of perfection from.
Okay, yeah.
I think maybe even that argument might have roots in Aquinas or something like that.
Okay.
But
the argument from Degrees is Aquinas'.
Aquinas
would have said he disagreed with the ontological argument.
Okay, yeah. But it would have been that it was something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember the precise argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't say I found I would have said I was an agnostic, and a real agnostic, someone who really wasn't sure about the existence of God.
Are you able to put probabilities on, if someone put a gun to your head and said, how probable is the existence of God at, let's say, a week after your deconversion? What would you have said?
It would have varied a lot day to day.
Okay, so let's say 1 week.
1 week.
Yeah,
I think
probably
I would probably have been more closer to atheism a week after.
Okay.
And then kind of the further I got from my deconversion, I would have, those questions were more up in the air.
Okay. And how about the historical claims of the New Testament? Would you have said, I think those are highly unlikely?
I would have said they're highly unlikely,
okay.
Yeah.
And why? What would have was it just the question of it seeming bland, or was there something about arguments for the historicity of the resurrection in particular that seemed weak to you?
I think it's a good question. I had read some criticisms of, kind of the typical kind of apologetics lines of argumentation, and I remember being fairly, found them fairly convincing.
Typical in what sense?
Well, like on the resurrection, for example,
like the minimal facts.
I mean, kind of like the Lee Strobel kind of approach. I remember there was one thing I read was like a talk by Richard Carrier, where he critiqued the idea of the resurrection.
Okay.
And I don't think, like, obviously I don't think Richard Carrier is like has a lot of substance to him, but I think rhetorically he can actually be somewhat good. Like, I think he had a debate with William Lane Craig on the resurrection. And I heard people say, "Oh, William Lane Craig actually absolutely destroyed him."
Yeah.
I didn't get that impression from the debate. Like, I felt like, at least rhetorically, he was fairly strong in that debate.
And by the way, ladies, Richard Carrier does have many girlfriends, so if you are interested, he may still be interested in finding a date. So keep your eye out. He's a real catch, I've heard. But nothing long term, he says. Let's not go further than that. Anyway, that's an interesting thing, because for me, regardless of what I've thought about the minimal facts approach, it seems in general the arguments for New Testament historicity from the moment I discovered them in the form that they're presented in the case of Christ to the present day have always struck me in as far as I can tell, as far superior to the critical analyses in terms of things like, let's just say, the authorship of the Gospels, for example. I think the authorship of the Gospels, the case for the traditional views, always struck me as so much stronger than any kind of idea, though, that these are anonymous documents. Do you have any thoughts on that at that point? Or was it more on the resurrection?
I mean, this was all somewhat new to me, right?
Right.
So I think at the time I had watched some Yale lectures on the New Testament, right?
I think I know the lectures you're talking about.
And
is the guy with a little mustache?
Yeah, he's
bald guy.
Bald guy. Yeah. He's and it seemed like the majority of, what struck me was that the majority of scholars disagreed strongly with the typical kind of Christian narrative.
Yeah. I mean, this is at some point, I think, especially the minimal facts thing, I understand that it's an approach, but its emphasis on facts that are granted by the majority of scholars, I think, creates the impression in people's mind that we should really take it seriously when the majority of scholars say one thing or the other. Where, the longer that I've thought about these issues, the less I care at all about what the majority of scholars say on anything. And it seems to me that it has very little correlation to the truth of things.
And we can get to kind of some of my thoughts, I think, a little bit later about what on the historical Jesus and this issue in modern scholarship.
Have you looked at that in more depth? I mean, we'll get to this when we get to it, but I don't think I've asked. Have you looked in more depth at these historical arguments since coming back, or in the process of coming back?
Yes, to a certain degree.
Okay. I
mean, I feel like I have a better grasp on just kind of how to read text in general.
Yeah.
Right. So. And this is a comment about, I think, a lot of scholarship, and maybe this sounds kind of, who am I to criticize the majority of scholarship?
Yeah.
But when I read someone like Plato, and I look at scholarly interpretations of Plato, it oftentimes seems to me that they're reading him very poorly.
Yeah.
And that they're missing a lot.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that's true across the board.
Yeah. At some you read these scholars, and I think when you start to have this sense, it's like, well, I must be missing something, and the longer you engage with this academic work, you come to the conclusion, I don't think I am missing anything. I think this really is just not good.
So I think when they're reading, when, for example, when someone says, well, Jesus is just a first century Jewish revolutionary, right? I think that's a fairly superficial reading of the New Testament. And,
So now you've deconverted. You're not sure about theism. You think the historical claims in the New Testament are pretty unlikely. Tell us when you start moving towards theism, or is there you move towards it, you move away from it? But I know you do become a theist, I think, a couple years later. What's the process that leads up to that?
I mean, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when I began to. Like I said, I was kind of interested in other religions at the time. So I took some time to kind of to study kind of other religions but I feel like I really got interested in other religions when I was 17, right?
Okay.
And so I felt...
And you deconvert at what age?
15.
15. Oh.
So I feel like almost in a certain way, when I was 17, I started to get a sense of, something spiritually more than just atheism. Like, I mean, I already was contemplating that possibility, but I really started to get a sense of that when I was 17.
A sense in what sense? Like a
intuitive
sense?
That religion was something more than just, an evolutionary maladaptation.
Yeah. I want to ask.
Yeah.
We're not really going to get to this topic in the interview, I don't think. But did you have strong opinions on evolution, and to what extent did those shape your thoughts on these issues?
Well, there were some. Actually, that was I would say an argument that evolution didn't seem to make a lot of sense, right?
It seemed to make a lot of sense.
Not make a lot of sense with Christianity. So I think that led to...
Like, theistic evolution doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah. And I don't have a strong opinion on this issue right now. I mean, I think it would be very hard to reconcile purely
neo-Darwinism.
With Christianity.
Yeah.
Although I'm open to the possibility that something more like an intelligent, like a form of intelligent design that still has common descent. I'm open to that possibility, but I'm not going to make a strong, I'm not going to make a strong stance on what position.
Are you open to the young Earth possibility?
Yeah. I mean, I would say we know so little that, and I mean, I don't want to get too much into it, but some of my thoughts about just the nature of science and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But, but I would say, sorry, what were you saying?
It was, what extent did evolution shape your views on theism, on Christianity at this point?
When I was 17 or 15?
When you were 17.
When I was 17. I started to, study evolution more, right? Like, I think I've read, I at least read part of The Selfish Gene. There was an author I read, named was Robert Wright, I believe.
Okay.
He wrote a book on, essentially a book where he defended evolutionary psychology. And he also wrote a book, actually, I listened to too, which was called The Evolution of God.
Okay.
Which was, I mean, it wasn't like a groundbreaking book at all. I mean, it was just like, it kind of essentially rehashed the typical views about the development of religion from animism to monotheism.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gave the typical, documentary hypothesis.
They talked about that view of the
Yeah,
Old
it talked
Testament.
about that. It presented Jesus as a Jewish zealot or something like that.
An apocalyptic preacher.
Yeah, but then he had this kind of weird conclusion that he said, well, maybe God does exist. And he says that because he seemed to say, well, it seems that morality is real. So it was...
Why?
Yeah.
Did he give a reason why he thought it was real?
It's been a while since I read the book, but he said that it seems like there was some place morality was going, right? Some place that morality was developing, I guess. He said that there was a telos to humans' moral development.
That's kind of the progressive arc,
Yeah.
That there's an arc of history towards justice.
Yeah.
Which, isn't false, but it's not true in the way that the secular progressive thinks it is. So tell us more about your, what starts leading you towards theism.
Well, okay, so I want to say this, just because I cite an author as inspiration or I found an author to be influential doesn't mean I agree or condone everything the author says.
Yeah. This is something you learn, and I give Jake credit, having not been on the internet as long as I have, or to the extent that I have, you learn pretty quickly that you have to put all these disclaimers in, or rumors will start circulating that you're a neoconservative, also an isolationist, occultist who hates Harry Potter, if you don't make these disclaimers. So
Okay.
Good idea. So tell us more about that.
So I think when I was like my timeline is so actually when I was around 16, I started getting into I think Freud, and then I also got into Carl Jung.
A Freudian,
right?
An occultist.
Yeah. and who is it? I also got into Joseph Campbell, right?
Right. Yeah.
So in some ways, these were kind of reintroductions. I mean, Jung and Campbell were to religion, and that religion was something more than just a belief in the afterlife. Or a belief, that people have so that they don't go to hell, right?
Yeah.
That there was something more. Well, I guess with Jung, it's that there was something psychologically important about religion.
And were you reading Jung himself, or were you reading books about Jung, or both?
Both. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I read a few books by Jung, and
this is when you're 17.
This was when I was 16. I was nearing 17 at that point.
Now, if I remember correctly, there was a point in time where you really started just reading voraciously, whereas before you really, at least to my knowledge, you really hadn't been.
Well, that was around 16.
Okay, because I remember being really struck and impressed by the apparent transformation in terms of the number and the quality of books you were digesting.
Yeah. So that was around 16, right?
Mm-hmm. And what was it? Did you make a conscious decision to start reading all this stuff, or was it just you became interested?
I just became interested.
You were unschooling at this point.
Or like homeschooled, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, self-directed education.
Self-directed,
not hippies, but
kind of as self-directed, where kind of my curriculum was just kind of reading a lot of books.
Yeah,
and I think really when I was kind of after my deconversion, I had taken a little bit of a departure from kind of philosophy. Right. Where I'd been kind of more interested in, and I started reading more science and things like that. But I felt like
physics, biology.
Yeah, kind of biology and some physics and things like that. But I felt like through Jung, I kind of came back to an interest in philosophy, right? Or into these, I guess you could say, broader kind of metaphysical kind of questions.
Yeah. Now, when naturalism was on the table, did you ever feel any of that fear that some people describe of just the blackness of nihilism? Did that ever strike you, or was that not really a thing in your mind?
Yeah, I would say it struck me at times.
Yeah.
I mean, it struck me, shortly after my deconversion, right? That there were parts of me that wondered, right? Is this all without meaning?
Yeah.
I mean, there were times when I felt like very close to atheism, and felt like kind of okay with that, but there were times when I didn't. Right?
Didn't feel okay with it.
I didn't feel okay with it.
Yeah. And would you just say that's a change in mood, or were you thinking of reasons why atheism might be okay? What was that?
I mean, I think it was both, probably.
Okay.
Like I think. Yeah, I would say it was both. Yeah.
Now, I do want to ask you the question because I remember noticing that you kept wearing your cross.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know. I'm superstitious, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't want to upset God if he, or as Bill O'Reilly said, throw it in with Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, when I got to, I think and this is going to be a little jumping ahead, right?
Yeah.
I think if someone would have asked me, I wouldn't have said, well, the cross still has symbolism, whether you accept, right?
Yeah.
Jesus or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're reading Jung, you're reading Freud,
or reading Campbell.
You're reading Campbell. You're asking these kind of philosophical questions again.
Yeah.
Where do you go from here?
Yeah. It's hard kind of looking back and tracing the progression. I think with Jung,
did you ever pray at this point?
I'm sure I did.
Do you remember?
I can't I think I started praying more when I was like 17, or when I actually made a formal conversion to theism.
Okay.
But
were there ever any like, God, if you're out there?
Oh yeah, I actually do remember praying a few times. Yeah.
With that kind of, if you're out there, would you please put up or shut up kind of things.
I think it was more just like asking for help for something, you know. Yeah.
So tell us then about the movement towards theism.
Yeah, well, like I said, I had kind of rediscovered kind of religious symbolism through Young and through Campbell, and it was a new perspective, right? I'd never really thought in those kind of terms before, right? Of what's the symbolic structure behind religion.
Yeah.
I think just in terms of arguments, when I was 17, I felt at times like, maybe naturalism is true, right?
Yeah.
Right. But I think one argument that kind of started to lead me to theism was the argument from objective morality.
Okay, yeah.
And it seemed to me, my thought is that it's hard to maintain objective morality without objective meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very hard to say that there are oughts if there's no end.
Right.
Like, if there's no ultimate end, it just seems all our actions are without...
End as in goal.
Goal, yeah. Like in an Aristotelian sense.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that, it would just render all, action meaningless. Now, that itself didn't necessarily... I mean, I said that seemed to be an argument for objective meaning, not necessarily theism, because, I mean, because you could say, like, for example, I mean, it's a little complicated, but you could say Buddhism is kind of an atheistic religion.
Right.
Or at least certain forms of Buddhism are.
Yeah.
And it seems there's still an objective end.
What was it that, because that reality was very acute to me when I was going through my crisis of faith, but it wasn't really an argument for the existence of God so much as it was an argument for the non-existence of objective morality. Well, why did it not function that way for you?
It seems like if you don't accept a sort of transcendent source of morality, or you don't accept objective meaning or whatever, or I guess, where am I going? It seems like what you have to fall back on is that essentially we're self-interested individuals who, in our self-interest, develop forms of morality, right?
Right, yeah.
So essentially the social contract, right?
Yeah. My question is why, I mean, maybe the world just sucks.
Yeah, no. It's, so I think the thing that is, it's like, it seems that there are certain actions which you could say are so perverse, right, that it doesn't seem to be that it's just a violation of a social contract.
That there's an immediate kind of knowledge of the evil of certain acts.
Yeah.
Kind of like there's an immediate knowledge of certain basic
Yeah. And it's like I couldn't bring myself to disbelieve, right, in that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it seemed that morality had to exist in some sense, or at least that was the conclusion, that I was unwilling to do away with morality.
And I want to make a distinction for the listeners here. There's the difference between it's not about unwilling to disbelieve in the objective heinousness of rape because I really want to believe otherwise. More, it seems like an immediately present reality. It's something that's just kind of part of the inbuilt programming.
Yeah. So I guess like the argument that like you can explain, for example, like how morality would develop under natural selection, right? You can explain that, right? Mm-hmm. But you can't seem to explain necessarily, where am I going? You can't, that still doesn't get to you should the ought.
Yeah.
And it also seems to me that it doesn't seem to still make sense about why we find certain actions so repulsive, right? Yeah, like
rape,
child
torture,
or like the Holocaust or something like that, right?
Yeah. So is that when you become a theist?
No, I mean, I would say I found that argument interesting, and I felt it was leading me towards a belief in some sort of objective meaning to reality. Okay. I think my progression to theism is, so I would say it's was also conversion to idealism, philosophical idealism.
Yeah. So would you have called it idealism at that point?
I would have called it idealism. Okay. I mean, I hadn't studied the idealists a lot, but I had this thought, which is, so let's take a chair for example, right?
Yeah.
So, like, the typical explanation is that the chair is a representation of a chair that's outside of consciousness.
Yeah,
right. But it seems if I strip all the conscious qualities of a chair, do I still have a chair?
Right.
And so, if I'm saying, well, then it seems like if I want to say that there's a chair outside of my consciousness, well, the chair it seems like the chair has no relation. The chair outside of consciousness has no relation to the chair inside of consciousness, right?
Yeah, right.
So why do we even postulate a chair outside consciousness?
Yeah.
And so
it's just for my listeners. Think about take the chair, and what do you have? You've got these philosophers would call qualia, the qualitative experiences. It's got a particular color. It's got a particular shape. When you feel it, it has a certain sense. You could lick it if you're a weirdo. It's going to have a certain taste. It's going to have these qualitative senses to it. And it's also going to have a physical structure. But when you ask, well, what does that mean, physical structure? You're going to get down to certain mathematical descriptions in terms of, at bottom, quantum mechanics, or at the larger level, in terms of gravitation. What are those? Those are mathematical equations. These are abstractions. These are ideas. And whether we're talking about qualia or we're talking about these mathematical equations which undergird the physical reality of the chair, in both cases we're talking about things which are in consciousness or in the mind. So we don't have anything left.
Or the very idea of a chair, which is something you sit in, right? Which is what a chair really is.
Yeah, the form of the chair.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with mathematical abstractions, formal abstractions, or qualitative experience. Is that a fair representation of what you're saying?
Well, it didn't seem to make sense to talk of a world outside of consciousness, because the world outside of consciousness didn't seem to have any similarity to the world that we live in, right?
Could you point to any particular author in showing you idealism?
I don't think it was a particular author, really. It was just kind of a thought I had.
But you would have called it idealism.
I I had heard the term before, that this idea that all reality is kind of nested in consciousness.
And this is how old are you at this point?
I was 17.
Okay, so one thing I've discovered talking with Jake is that we've had a lot of the same conclusions and a lot of parallel trajectories of thought, even in areas where because I thought about idealism and conceived the world in these terms, I think several years later. And I actually didn't know before just now that it went back for him so long, which I think is interesting and speaks to divine providence. But speak to the role that had in leading you to theism.
I think at that level, it doesn't seem to be that much more of a step to say, like theism. I guess idealism itself doesn't necessarily entail theism or kind of a classical theistic kind of portrayal of the world. Mm-hmm. But it just felt like kind of the trajectory I was moving towards.
Like things were falling into place.
Yeah, that it just seemed to make sense, right? That we could talk about a sort of you could say a cosmic mind, or a sort of ultimate mind, which held all things together within its mind.
And were there any other philosophical arguments for the existence of God that you had looked at in a serious way or in a semi-serious way?
I think a month later or something, I read a
month later from what?
From that realization
about idealism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That realization about idealism, was it a very distinct moment for you because there are certain moments for me when a thought occurs to me, and that thought then kind of, you look back on it and you see it growing into all this other stuff. Is that the kind of thing it was? Or is it just you can't pinpoint exactly when it became perfectly clear?
When I kind of remember, I don't remember exact, but I remember just having the thought one day and just,
Because for me, I remember in 2000, around the time you were deconverting, actually, I have two very distinct experiences that I remember in my mind. I remember everything about my surroundings. The first one was the realization of the hard problem of consciousness, which actually, I'd never actually encountered the form of the hard problem of consciousness. I didn't even realize it was a problem. But then I was just thinking about basically what philosophers call the zombie problem, in that I could describe a materialist brain comprehensively, and that still wouldn't explain why it's superimposed upon that is this layer of qualitative experience. And I realized, I didn't have terms for it at the point, but I realized there's something that is not material here in conventional terms. And then the other instance is the realization of the nature of necessity and the fact that the world is contingent, and that the argument from contingency seems to be a very powerful argument for the existence of God. So your idealism, was it like that to some degree?
Yeah. It was. I mean, it happened very fast. I mean, it was almost like I knew it to be true, kind of.
Right.
It was.
Yeah.
I mean, and then
the sense of epiphany, by the way, is something I want to make a video on, because epiphany can be something which is wonderful, but it can also be an intoxicating experience in that you can have an epiphany, and the sense that things are falling into place can be so powerful that it will lock you out of ever considering that you might have been wrong. When you deconverted, was there a similar sense of epiphany?
Like I realized that Christianity could be wrong.
Yeah. Or that it was wrong. Would you...
I mean, it felt to me like this belief in idealism was a much deeper sense of epiphany. Yeah. Right? It almost felt like it was so obvious I couldn't turn back. I mean, it was a type of argument, I think, like, for example, Anselm's trying to get at with the ontological argument, right? Which is this...
Sorry, could you repeat?
Anselm, with his ontological argument.
Yeah.
It seems to... What he's trying to do in that argument is he wants to create an argument for God to where once you see it, you can't unsee it in that way.
Right.
And that's what it felt like to me with this argument for idealism.
Yeah.
And I can't say, like, maybe this is my own fault or whatever, but I can't say I ever really, like, doubted after that point idealism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, honestly, for me, I'm speaking strictly for myself, people, by the way, but for me, it has honestly been the same thing with, and I don't want to create too much of a stir here. I know it's a touchy subject, so don't be touchy about it. For the young earth thing, I mean, honestly, and it's bizarre thinking about it, but that is probably the thing about which I've had the least doubts, because I feel so assured that the process by which I came to that conclusion was a careful process, not something I just desperately grasped after. So I think I understand what you mean. So idealism, what's the road to theism from there?
Well, I guess...
Or is that the road? Is that theism?
I mean, this was... I mean, at that point, I was basically a theist. I mean, at the time, I, been studying religion. Like I had found the works of... I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Mircea Eliade.
Okay.
Who was like a Romanian kind of historian and scholar of religion.
Is he well known?
Yeah, he's fairly well known. I mean, he's somewhat associated with like the traditionalists, kind of.
Like Evola?
Yeah, like I think he wrote letters to Evola. He also wrote letters to Jan, and I think he might have known René Guénon or whatever.
Okay.
But they.
And this is when you're 17?
I started getting into work when I think I started reading his History of Religion when I was 17.
Yeah, Jake is more broadly read than I am.
I don't know if that's true.
More broadly. I'm not going to say there are certain subjects about which are more deeply read, but Jake has a greater breadth of reading than me. So,
but around this time, I mean, even before like my conversion to theism, and hopefully I won't be misunderstood here when I say this.
Mm-hmm.
I was never saying prayers to Satan. I was never like invoking demons.
Like before your conversion.
Yeah. I started to get kind of an interest, you could say, in kind of broadly speaking, kind of Western esotericism.
Right. Okay.
So like kind of the Hellenistic kind of philosophies and like Neoplatonism and things like that.
Okay. And were you just out of curiosity? Were you concerned? Was there any fear over, because there is some people say, look at this stuff and say, or an enchanted view of the world, oh, this is devilish, or was there any kind of latent concern over that or not?
I mean, a little bit, yeah, but I think looking at some of the arguments I read online by certain Christians, they seem so silly and to be such a kind of a misunderstanding. That I mean, they kind of looked. I mean, the arguments kind of looked kind of foolish, to be honest. Yeah.
So,
but I mean, I wasn't like interested in like doing magical rictuals to get a lot of money, or I wasn't interested in like contacting like spirit guides, or something like that. I mean, I think I would have still had a sort of suspicion about those types of things.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah.
So you're now a theist.
Shortly after, my realization about idealism, I found, again, I'm going to mention someone who's a little controversial, David Bentley Hart. Again, I'm not...
He was all right. I mean, he was better back then, by the way.
But I read his book, Experience of God,
yeah.
and I thought that was very good.
Yeah.
And I thought the arguments were fairly strong. Mm-hmm. And...
Against atheism?
Against atheism. Yeah. I mean, he articulates the argument for contingency, which I felt at the time, and I still feel that it's one of the strongest arguments for the existence of God. Yeah. So with David Bentley Hart, I mean, I felt like at that point I could say I'm a theist.
And a theist, you would say, in the sense of God, not just as beyond good and evil, not just as kind of the cosmic watchmaker, but as someone who is the ground of our morality, you would say.
He's the ground. I mean, I would say, you could, again, my vision of reality wasn't too clear, right? Mm-hmm. But in some sense, we could say the end was a sort of mysticism or a sort of contemplation of God, mm-hmm. right?
And would you say that he had a special interest in human beings at this point?
I think I would have had trouble kind of articulating a vision of God exactly.
Yeah.
I think I would have said something like, in him we move and have our being, something like that. But did he take interest in individuals? I don't think I would have said a definite yes, mm-hmm. right? That he but I wouldn't have made a definite no either, right? Because I would have, because I began to have a sort of interest, kind of in mysticism or things like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, had you become cognizant that there were maybe more satisfying versions or interpretations of Christianity out there?
Oh yeah, I would say this all kind of, with my interest, you could say broadly, you could say in the Western mystical tradition or whatever, was a rediscovery of kind of Christian mysticism or kind of Christian visions of. So I started to go and kind of understand kind of Christianity more from the outside.
Yeah.
Then really I had almost a better grasp of it than I did from the inside.
So at this point in time, would you say that did you have any questions? Maybe Christianity has something to it, or
yeah. Well, I guess what I started to move to was, and this again, this is not necessarily a unified school of thought, but some form of perennialism. Right. So it seemed to me like even David Bentley Hart's kind of book seems to kind of play with that idea a bit.
Yeah.
That there seems to be some sort of common experience of God.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, maybe, these religions kind of differ kind of in their esoteric form, but that they have some unity.
Exoteric?
Kind of their outer form. They differ.
Form, yeah.
But they have
an inner unity.
They have an inner unity, right? And they're mystical.
And did you have any? Did you start to wonder? And I mean, you don't have to say yes. Yeah. I'm just wondering. Did you start to wonder about? Well, maybe Jesus. Maybe there's a possibility that Jesus is more than, just some guy. Maybe there's a possibility that the resurrection has something to it, or no? Were you not really, or were you just not thinking about it?
I would say, I mean, it probably depended on the day, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there were parts of me that wondered, right?
Yeah.
But I guess there were parts of me that I wasn't thinking about it. I think what I felt like at the time, and I don't think I was entirely wrong, mm-hmm. was that as I studied religion more, there did seem to be some real commonalities. Now,
yeah.
I heard one Christian apologist say, religions only agree in superficial matters.
Yeah, that's obvious crap.
But disagree on essential matters, right? And from studying religions, it didn't seem that was the case, right?
Yeah.
It seemed that in some sense you could say that there was a sort of universal symbolism.
Yeah. I'm going to make a video on the concept of paganism and why it's so toxic to our view of of the world, because when we think about paganism as a category, we end up categorizing all of this material that actually belongs to a divine deposit of revelation that, in my view, comes from Adam through Noah, that then gets corrupted in certain respects, but there remains this universal grammar, as Jake said. There remains this core structure, which is discernible even despite those corruptions, and there remain certain developments in wisdom that occur outside of the scope of specifically the Abrahamic covenant. Because if we're thinking from a biblical and historical point of view, we have to remember that the nations exist concretely in covenant with God. The Noachic covenant is not some abstract covenant which never happened historically. It's something very concrete. And the nations existed and built sacrificial altars and built temples in relation to that Noachic covenant. So I'm not speaking for Jake here, I'm speaking for myself, but we are going to talk about that in a video. So you are a theist at this point.
Yeah, I was a theist, and I would have said I was kind of, I kind of had sort of a perennialist kind of conception. I was very interested in kind of the world's mystical traditions, and it felt like there was real meaning to the world.
Right.
But yeah.
So I'm gonna wrap up our part 1 on that video. It feels like now that you've arrived at theism, it's a good place to stop. I don't know how many parts this will end up being, but the part which describes the journey, all the way to Christianity, will be public, because I think it's a very illuminating and insightful interview. And the final part, I think, which we'll get into maybe some specific questions, will be premium content. So if you have not become a patron, please do consider it if you are financially able. But if you are not, and if you are a patron, please do remember me and Jake in your prayers. That's the most important service you can give. And with that said, we will see you tomorrow, or maybe I'll upload it the day after, with part 2 of this interview. Thank you very much.